children commit murder, courts expect remorse. Instead, some displayed chilling indifference that shocked the court. One 10-year-old earned the nickname "the boy who never cried" after brutally killing a toddler. Another mouthed, "I don't give a" at sentencing. Their reactions revealed something far more terrifying than the crimes themselves. The James Bulger case. In the annals of criminal history, few cases have struck at the very heart of society's understanding of childhood innocence, quite like the murder of James Bulger. On a cold February day in 1993, two 10-year-old boys, Robert Thompson and John Venables, committed what would become known as one of the most shocking crimes in modern British history. The case didn't just horrify because of its brutality, it fundamentally challenged everything we thought we knew about the capacity for evil in children. James Patrick Bulger, just 2 years old, was abducted from the New Strand shopping centre in Bootle, while with his mother, Denise Fergus. What followed was a nightmare that would haunt a nation. The two boys, Thompson and Venables, led little James on a 2.5-mile walk across Liverpool, passing by around 38 people, most of whom did not intervene. The journey itself was a prolonged torture, as the boys subjected James to cruelty that defied comprehension. The brutality that followed was beyond anything most could imagine. James suffered 42 injuries, including 10 skull fractures, severe bruising, and mutilation. The boys dropped a 22-pound railway fish plate on his head, threw bricks and stones at him, and subjected him to acts of violence that the trial judge would later describe as an act of unparalleled evil and barbarity. They even placed batteries in his mouth, and possibly his and forcibly pulled back his foreskin, raising suspicions of sexual assault. But perhaps what shocked the court and the public most wasn't just the crime itself, it was the complete absence of remorse from the perpetrators. During the trial, Robert Thompson was noted for his coolness and lack of emotion, earning the nickname "the boy who did not cry." His stoic demeanor unnerved police officers, psychiatrists, and court officials alike. John Venables was more emotional, but did not express genuine remorse, with his tears interpreted as fear rather than guilt. The courtroom atmosphere was electric with tension, as these young faces stared back at the judge and jury with what many described as chilling indifference. Psychological evaluations later indicated both suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, with Venables showing some signs of guilt through nightmares and asking if James was in the courtroom. However, a psychiatric report suggested Thompson might be an undiagnosed psychopath, citing his lack of remorse and empathy, though this was ultimately dismissed. The case became a watershed moment in British criminal justice, with the boys becoming the youngest convicted murderers in modern British history when they were found guilty on November 24, 1993. Their cold reactions during the trial proceedings became legendary among court officials, representing a level of detachment that seemed almost inhuman in children so young. As the legal system grappled with how to handle such young offenders who showed no apparent understanding of their heinous acts, another case across the Atlantic would soon capture headlines with its own shocking display of youthful callousness. Brianna Gay murder. The murder of Brianna Gay in 2023 represented a new kind of horror, one that combined the calculated cruelty of digital-age teenagers with a level of premeditation that left seasoned legal professionals stunned. Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe, both 15 at the time of the crime, were convicted of murdering 16-year-old Brianna Gay on February 11, 2023 in Culcheth, Warrington. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of teenage rebellion gone wrong. It was a premeditated attack involving stabbing Brianna 28 times with a hunting knife. What made this case particularly chilling was the methodical planning that preceded the murder. Evidence revealed a kill list created by Jenkinson, which included Brianna as the only transgender individual on the list. The level of calculation was staggering. These weren't impulsive children acting out, but teenagers who had spent weeks plotting the death of their peer. During the trial at Manchester Crown Court, the defendant's reactions shocked even experienced legal professionals. Jenkinson, diagnosed with severe conduct dissocial disorder, lied repeatedly and expressed a desire to kill again. Her behavior in court was marked by what observers described as an almost casual indifference to the gravity of the proceedings. In a post-conviction interview with child psychiatrist Dr. Richard Church, Jenkinson admitted to stabbing Brianna repeatedly, describing the act as exciting and stating she wanted to kill her so she would always be with her. Eddie Ratcliffe, diagnosed with mild autistic spectrum disorder and selective mutism, communicated via a keyboard during the trial. Despite these challenges, he coped well with giving evidence, but showed no remorse during the trial proceedings. His cold efficiency in answering questions and his apparent detachment from the emotional weight of his actions left court officials deeply unsettled. Perhaps most disturbing was their post-murder behavior. Media reports noted their communications after the incident, such as messaging each other about the murder without showing concern. When Jenkinson messaged about a woman got stabbed, Ratcliffe replied, "Holy crap," despite being present at the murder, suggesting an attempt to cover up rather than express regret. During sentencing on February 2, 2024, Mrs. Justice Yip described the murder as as brutal, planned, and sadistic, emphasizing the lack of remorse from both defendants. The judge's remarks highlighted that neither showed remorse during the legal process, with Jenkinson's multiple lies and Ratcliffe's selective mutism not translating into expressions of regret. Jenkinson received a minimum term of 22 years, while Ratcliffe received 20 years. The courtroom atmosphere during the proceedings was described by those present as profoundly unsettling, with the defendants' apparent pride in their actions creating an almost surreal disconnect from the reality of their situation. Their case demonstrated how modern technology and social media could amplify the worst impulses of troubled teenagers, creating killers who seem to view their actions through the lens of digital entertainment rather than real human consequences. The shocking nature of their court reactions would soon be echoed in another case involving a teenage killer whose emotional apology would surprise everyone who witnessed it. Alyssa Bustamante. In the world of juvenile crime, few cases present such a stark contradiction between action and apparent remorse as that of Alyssa Bustamante. At just 15 years old, this Missouri teenager was convicted for the murder of 9-year-old Elizabeth Alton in 2009, creating a case that would challenge every assumption about teenage psychology and the capacity for genuine regret. On October 21, 2009, Bustamante lured her young neighbor into the woods near their homes, where she strangled and stabbed Elizabeth to death before burying her body in a shallow grave. What made this crime particularly disturbing wasn't just its brutality, but the chilling entries Bustamante made in her diary afterward. She described the murder as amazing and pretty enjoyable, revealing a mindset that seemed to take genuine pleasure in taking another person's life. The case took several years to wind its way through the legal system, with Bustamante initially charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action. In January 2012, she accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action. What followed at her sentencing hearing on February 8, 2012, would become one of the most talked-about moments in juvenile criminal justice. During her sentencing, Bustamante delivered what many found to be a shocking, emotional apology to Elizabeth's family. Standing with her hands shackled to her waist and feet shackled together, she rose to face Elizabeth's mother, Patricia Price, and her siblings. "I just want you guys to know that I really am sorry for everything. I know that words can never be enough, and they can never adequately describe how horrible I feel for all of this. I'm so sorry. If I could give my life to give her back, I would," she said, pausing to compose herself as emotion overwhelmed her voice. The courtroom fell silent as this teenager, who had written so callously about her victim's death, seemed to struggle with genuine remorse. The Guardian reported that she paused to take a deep breath, struggling to compose herself. The contrast between her diary entries describing the murder as thrilling and her tearful apology in court created a jarring disconnect that left legal observers and the public grappling with questions about the nature of teenage psychology and the possibility of genuine rehabilitation. Patricia Price, Elizabeth's mother, stared with apparent anger during the apology and later called Bustamante an evil monster in her own statement, speaking so passionately that the judge had to intervene. The victim's family's raw emotion stood in stark contrast to Bustamante's apparently genuine regret, creating a complex emotional landscape in the courtroom. What made this reaction particularly shocking was its authenticity. After the sentencing, as Bustamante left the courthouse, she did not appear to express any emotion, suggesting that her courtroom apology wasn't performed for effect, but represented a genuine moment of recognition of the harm she had caused. She was ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole for the murder charge, plus a consecutive 30 years for armed criminal action. The case continued to generate controversy, with her 2024 parole hearing being denied and her next hearing scheduled for 2029. The authenticity of Bustamante's remorse remains a subject of debate among criminologists and legal professionals, but her emotional breakdown in court provided a stark contrast to cases where young killers showed no emotion whatsoever, as demonstrated in the next case involving a teenager whose courtroom demeanor would prove equally memorable for entirely different reasons. Ari Morales. The 2009 Richmond High School gang rape case shocked California and the nation, not just for its brutality, but for the way it exposed the depths of cruelty that teenagers could inflict upon their peers. Among the defendants, Ari Morales stood out, not for his prominence in the crime, but for his reaction when forced to confront his actions in a court of law. The crime occurred on October 24, 2009, during a homecoming dance involving the brutal assault of a 16-year-old girl in a dark courtyard on the Richmond High School campus. Morales, who was 16 at the time, was one of 6 men charged in connection with the attack, which involved the victim being beaten, raped, and otherwise sexually abused for more than 2 hours. Morales was charged as an adult and eventually pleaded guilty to charges including rape in concert, penetration with a foreign object, and forced oral copulation in concert, resulting in a 27-year prison sentence. However, it was his demeanor during testimony against his co-defendants that would create one of the most memorable moments in the courtroom proceedings. On June 20th, 2013, during his testimony against co-defendants Marcel Peter and Jose Montano, Morales appeared ashamed on the witness stand as he described what he and others did to the victim. Court observers noted that his eyes gazed to the floor at times during his recounting of the events, a physical manifestation of what appeared to be genuine shame and discomfort with having to relive and describe his participation in the brutal attack. The contrast was striking for those who had followed the case. Here was a young man who had participated in one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, yet when forced to confront his actions in the formal setting of a courtroom, he displayed a level of visible shame that surprised legal observers. Richmond Confidential reported that Morales told prosecutor John Cope he was stupid to have participated in the attack on the victim, a verbal admission that complemented his physical displays of discomfort. This reaction was particularly notable given the context of public opinion surrounding the case. Some supporters had maintained Morales' innocence, with online comments claiming there's no scientific evidence or DNA or fingerprints linking this young man to the crimes. Yet his own testimony and visible shame in court painted a different picture, that of someone who understood the gravity of his actions and felt genuine remorse for his participation. The courtroom dynamics during Morales' testimony were described by those present as intensely uncomfortable. His obvious distress while recounting the details of the attack created a palpable tension as legal professionals and observers witnessed what appeared to be a genuine reckoning with guilt. Unlike other cases where defendants maintained their innocence or showed defiance, Morales' reaction suggested an internal struggle with the weight of his actions. The case resulted in varying sentences for the defendants, with Jose Montano receiving 33 years to life, Marcel Peter getting 29 years to life, and Manuel Ortega receiving 32 years. Morales' cooperation with prosecutors and his visible remorse may have influenced his relatively lighter sentence compared to some of his co-defendants. His testimony and the shame he displayed would be remembered by court officials as one of the rare instances where a young defendant in such a serious case appeared to genuinely grapple with the moral weight of his actions, providing a stark contrast to the next case where a teenage killer's complete lack of emotional response would create an entirely different kind of courtroom shock. Tyler Hadley. In the realm of teenage killers who shocked courts with their reactions, Tyler Hadley stands as perhaps the most chilling example of complete emotional detachment. At 17 years old, Hadley committed one of the most disturbing crimes imaginable. He murdered both of his parents with a hammer, then cleaned up the scene and hosted a party while their bodies lay hidden in a bedroom. On July 16, 2011, in Port St. Lucie, Florida, Hadley used a hammer to bludgeon his parents, Blake and Mary Jo Hadley, to death. The murders were particularly brutal, with forensic evidence suggesting the parents were alive for most of the attack, but what followed was perhaps even more disturbing than the murders themselves. After killing his parents, Hadley spent 3 hours cleaning up the blood and then hosted a party for about 60 people, inviting friends via Facebook and engaging in activities like playing beer pong and drinking. Throughout the evening, he maintained a facade of normalcy, while his parents' bodies remained locked in a bedroom just feet away from the celebrations. When Hadley's case finally reached the courtroom for his sentencing hearing on March 11, 2014, legal professionals and observers would witness one of the most unsettling displays of emotional vacancy ever recorded in a juvenile murder case. During the hearing, gruesome photos of his parents' bodies and the crime scene were displayed on a large screen, showing blood spatter on the tile floor, furniture, and the master bedroom where the bodies were hidden. As these graphic images were presented, Hadley, then 20, showed absolutely no reaction. Court officials and observers described the scene as profoundly disturbing. Here was a young man looking at photographs of his own parents' mutilated bodies with the same emotional engagement he might show while reading a grocery list. The lack of reaction was so complete and so chilling that it became a defining characteristic of the proceedings. Even seasoned court officials who had witnessed countless criminal cases found themselves unnerved by Hadley's complete emotional absence. There were no tears, no visible distress, no signs of recognition of the horror displayed before him, just blank, empty staring. But perhaps the most shocking moment came as the hearing concluded. As Hadley exited the courtroom, He smiled at his family members who were present. This gesture was so jarring and inappropriate given the circumstances that it left everyone who witnessed it stunned. Here was someone who had just been confronted with graphic evidence of his parents' murders, and his response was to smile at his relatives as if he were leaving a casual social gathering. Judge Robert R. Malcolmson, clearly affected by Hadley's demeanor, sentenced him to 2 consecutive life sentences without parole, describing the crime as brutal, heinous, and premeditated, and accusing Hadley of manipulating experts and lying about hearing voices. The judge's comments suggested that Hadley's courtroom behavior had influenced his perception of the defendant as someone completely lacking in human empathy. The case became even more complex when Hadley's initial sentence was overturned in 2016 due to the Supreme Court ruling in Miller v. Alabama, which prohibited mandatory life sentences for juveniles. During his resentencing in 2018, reports noted that Hadley stared straight ahead and showed no emotion when told he'd be serving life, reinforcing his consistent lack of emotional response in court settings. Hadley's complete emotional detachment during his court appearances became legendary among legal professionals, representing a level of callousness that seemed almost inhuman. His case demonstrated how some young killers could display such complete emotional absence that it challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and the possibility of rehabilitation. The shocking nature of Hadley's emotionless responses would find an eerie parallel in another case involving a teenage girl, whose infamous words after a school shooting would become equally legendary in the annals of juvenile crime. Brenda Ann Spencer, I don't like Mondays. Long before school shootings became a tragically common occurrence in America, one teenage girl's callous explanation for her violent actions would create a phrase that would echo through decades of criminal justice history. Brenda Ann Spencer, just 16 years old, carried out what is often cited as one of the first modern school shootings in the United States on January 29, 1979, at Grover Cleveland Elementary School in San Diego. Using a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle given to her as a Christmas gift by her father, Spencer opened fire from her home across the street from the school, killing 2 adults, Principal Burton Ragg and custodian Mike Suchar, and injuring 9 others, including 8 children and a police officer. But it wasn't just the shooting itself that shocked the nation. It was Spencer's chilling explanation for her actions that would become infamous. When a reporter contacted Spencer during the standoff that followed the shooting, asking why she had committed this horrific act, her response was delivered with a casual indifference that stunned everyone who heard it. Spencer simply stated, "I don't like Mondays. This livens up the day," a remark so callous and trivial that it seemed to trivialize the lives she had taken and the terror she had inflicted. This statement, made not in a formal courtroom setting but to the media during the immediate aftermath of her crime, revealed a level of emotional detachment that was profoundly disturbing. The idea that someone could kill innocent people, including children, and then explain it away as a remedy for Monday morning boredom spoke to a psychological disconnect that challenged every assumption about human empathy and the capacity for evil in teenagers. The phrase became so notorious that it inspired the song I Don't Like Mondays by the Boomtown Rats, immortalizing Spencer's callous words in popular culture. The song helped ensure that her chilling explanation would be remembered long after the immediate news coverage faded, making her case a landmark in discussions about youth violence and the psychology of teenage killers. When Spencer's case reached the legal system, she was charged as an adult due to the severity of her crimes. On April 4, 1980, just after her 18th birthday, she pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder and assault with a deadly weapon. Unlike many of the other cases in this series, detailed records of Spencer's specific courtroom behavior during her trial don't document any notable emotional outbursts or shocking reactions during the formal legal proceedings. However, her earlier statement to the media had already established her as someone whose emotional response to violence was fundamentally different from what society expected. The casual nature of her explanation, combined with reports of her troubled background, including allegations of poverty, neglect, and abuse, painted a picture of a deeply damaged individual whose capacity for normal emotional responses had been severely compromised. Spencer was sentenced to concurrent terms of 25 years to life in prison, with parole eligibility after 25 years. Her case became a watershed moment in American criminal justice, marking one of the first times the nation had to grapple with the reality of a teenage girl committing mass violence with such apparent indifference to human life. Spencer has been eligible for parole since 1993, with hearings in 1993, 2001, 2005, 2009, 9, 2022, and most recently in February 2025, where she was denied parole again, with her next hearing scheduled for 2028. Throughout these proceedings, the victims' families and survivors have consistently opposed her release, with the memory of her callous explanation serving as a reminder of the psychological damage her actions inflicted. The legacy of Spencer's "I don't like Mondays" statement extends far beyond her individual case. It became a cultural touchstone for discussions about the banality of evil and the capacity for teenagers to commit horrific acts with seeming emotional indifference. Her words demonstrated how a single phrase could encapsulate the profound disconnect between normal human empathy and the psychological state necessary to commit mass violence. Spencer's case would pave the way for understanding how some young killers could display such profound emotional detachment, a pattern that would be seen again in future cases, including the next shocking example of a teenager whose courtroom behavior would reveal an equally disturbing lack of human empathy. James Fairweather. In the annals of teenage killers whose courtroom reactions shocked legal professionals, few cases exemplify the complete absence of remorse quite like that of James Fairweather. At just 15 years old, Fairweather committed 2 brutal murders in Colchester, Essex in 2014, displaying a level of violence and subsequent indifference that left seasoned court officials struggling to comprehend. Fairweather's first victim was James Atfield, a 33-year-old father of 4 with a brain injury, whom he stabbed 102 times in Castle Park on March 29, 2014, while Atfield was drunk and helpless. The sheer number of wounds inflicted demonstrated a level of sustained violence that went far beyond what was necessary to kill. It revealed someone who took pleasure in the act of causing pain and death. 3 months later, on June 17, 2014, Fairweather attacked Nahid Al-Manea, a 31-year-old Saudi student, stabbing her with a bayonet, including in both eyes, as she walked along a nature trail. The deliberate targeting of the eyes suggested a level of sadistic cruelty that distinguished Fairweather's crimes from typical teenage violence. Fairweather was known to have an obsessive interest in serial killers, including Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, and Ted Bundy, whom he regarded as his favorite murderer. This obsession wasn't merely academic. The judge later noted that this interest undeniably fueled these killings, and that Fairweather was seeking to emulate these notorious figures. Fairweather was apprehended in May 2015 while planning a 3rd murder, and in January 2016 he pleaded guilty to the murders. However, it was his behavior during the sentencing hearing on April 29, 2016, at the Old Bailey that would create one of the most shocking moments in recent British criminal justice history. As Mr. Justice Robin Spencer QC delivered the sentence, detention at Her Majesty's pleasure with a minimum term of 27 years, Fairweather's reaction was one of complete defiance and indifference. He shrugged his shoulders dismissively and mouthed, "I don't give a shit," towards his parents, who were present in the courtroom. This moment was particularly shocking for several reasons. First, the gesture was directed at his own family members, who were already dealing with the trauma of learning about their son's horrific crimes. His mother, Anita, was visibly emotional and broke down in tears, creating a heartbreaking contrast between her obvious pain and her son's callous indifference. Before this shocking display, Fairweather had given a thumbs up to his parents and signaled to his mother to keep your chin up, suggesting that his final gesture wasn't spontaneous, but rather part of a calculated display of defiance. The progression from encouragement to crude dismissal demonstrated a kind of psychological manipulation that left court observers profoundly disturbed. The courtroom atmosphere during this moment was described by those present as electric with shock and disgust. Here was a teenager who had just been sentenced for 2 of the most brutal murders in recent British history, and his response was not remorse, not fear, not even anger, but a casual, almost bored dismissal of the entire proceedings. The contrast between the gravity of his crimes and his flippant reaction created a cognitive dissonance that left legal professionals struggling to process what they had witnessed. Judge Spencer's description of the murders as brutal, relentless, and cowardly seemed almost understated in light of Fairweather's courtroom behavior. The judge noted that had Fairweather been older, he might have faced a whole life term due to the sadistic conduct involved, and Fairweather's reaction seemed to validate this assessment of his character. Psychiatric assessments revealed that Fairweather was diagnosed with emerging psychopathic personality disorder and autistic spectrum disorder, though the jury had rejected his diminished responsibility defense. His courtroom behavior seemed to confirm the psychological evaluation that suggested he lacked the capacity for normal human empathy. During the sentencing, it was also revealed that Fairweather had expressed a desire to kill 15 more people, further highlighting his complete disconnect from normal moral boundaries. His casual dismissal of the court proceedings suggested that he viewed his conviction not as justice for his victims, but merely as an inconvenience to his plans for future violence. The impact of Fairweather's reaction extended beyond the immediate courtroom. His display of callous indifference became a talking point in discussions about juvenile justice and the capacity for rehabilitation rehabilitation among young offenders who showed such profound psychological abnormalities. The case raised uncomfortable questions about whether someone capable of such casual cruelty could ever be safely returned to society. Fairweather's "I don't give a shit" moment would be remembered by court officials as one of the most chilling displays of indifference they had ever witnessed, setting a new standard for callous behavior that would influence how future cases involving teenage killers were approached and understood. If you love this video, then click on the card showing on your screen for more videos like this.